The ongoing war in Bosnia saw the continuation of the ethnic cleansing that had become such an ugly feature, while Bosnian government forces had become fractured into a series of enclaves, many of which in the east particularly were under siege by the well-equipped Bosnian Serb militias. One such enclave was the town of Srebrenica, pre-war population about 5,700, of whom about 60% in the 1991 census identified as Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims in the parlance of the day, with just under 30% identifying as Serbs. The town had been under siege for nearly a year by April 1993, with the Bosnian Serbs surrounding it, conducting systematic destruction of the outlying villages and deportations and massacres of the populations, as well as denying passage to UN aid convoys to the town, while the Bosnian army forces based inside the town were also not entirely averse to sallying out and burning a few Serb villages either, notably at Kravica on the 7th of January, while the defending Serb soldiers were celebrating Orthodox Christmas. Civilian casualties on that occasion were comparatively low, but it hardened attitudes and made any chance of peace much less likely. And so shortly after the European Grand Prix, with 30 to 40 people a day dying in Srebrenica from the combination of incoming fire, starvation, exposure and lack of medical treatment, the UN passed a resolution declaring the town a safe zone, which would be protected by an expansion of UNPROFOR's powers. Unfortunately, while the resolution passed unopposed, the actual means by which the lightly armed UN troops on the ground would actually be able to carry out the defence of Srebrenica, especially if by doing so the entire UN would immediately be seen to be taking sides, was unclear. 3 days later, another siege ended in violence, as the US government forces surrounding the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, decided after 51 days to try and force the occupants out with tear gas, apparently prompted by reports that cult leader David Koresh was abusing babies and young children in the compound. Armoured vehicles punched holes in the walls of the buildings, so tear gas canisters could be fired in, but in very short order the buildings were aflame, and 76 of the 85 people in the compound, including Koresh himself and all the children, died in the fire or were shot and killed by themselves or fellow cult members to avoid that fate. Exactly what happened remains a subject of hot debate, conspiracy theory and hearsay. Surviving Branch Davidians insisted that the government forces had opened fire, or that the CS gas canisters themselves had ignited debris or curtains, while surveillance recordings indicate, but not conclusively, that Koresh was instructing people to pour petrol around and start fires during the initial manoeuvres. It had certainly been a difficult start to the job for the US's first female Attorney General, Janet Reno, who'd been in place for just 3 weeks, after replacing William Barr with the beginning of the Clinton presidency. And the world gained another country, as Eritrea voted 99.8% for independence. Eritrea had been part of the Italian colonial empire and placed under interim British control after World War II, and in 1950, on the recommendation of the UN, the Ethiopian-Eritrean Federation was formed, a situation neither side was particularly happy with. The former felt that Eritrea was a natural part of Ethiopia unjustly taken by the Italians, while the latter wanted full independence. After just over 10 years of an uneasy federation, Haile Selassie ordered the annexation of Eritrea and its conversion into a simple province of Ethiopia, and an independence movement immediately sprung up. The 30-year-long Eritrean War of Independence had continued, gaining new world significance when Haile Selassie was overthrown by a communist regime called the Derg, which saw the independence war become a general civil war, with the Ethiopian government forces supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. Eventually, following the devastating famine of the mid-90s and the collapse of Soviet communism, the Derg also fell, and the conditions were created for the exhausted people to again talk about independence. The Eritrean flag was raised over Asmara a few days after the referendum, and in May, Eritrea became the 182nd member state of the UN. But the resistance movement, the Eritrea People's Liberation Front, EPLF, seized power, established a one-party state, and banned all political activity. As of the time of writing and recording in early 2025, Eritrea has still never held an election. And so to Eritrea's former colonial master, Italy, where the transporters gathered at Imola for the San Marino Grand Prix. And once again, much of the talk between the races contained the words Senna, Ford, McLaren and Benetton, with the Brazilian star and current championship leader saying he wouldn't travel a week before the race. FOCA managed to get the various parties together at a hotel at Heathrow, where Dennis offered Briatore a deal: tag engine management technology in exchange for the latest Ford Series 7 engine. Not the Series 8, as I mistakenly said in the last video. Briatore didn't say no immediately, but before he'd said anything else, Ron got on the phone to Ayrton in Sao Paulo to tell him he'd got the deal, and Senna hopped on a plane to Italy, arriving at the circuit on Friday morning, to discover not everything was quite as he believed, that Ford in fact weren't willing to play ball with tag, and so Senna spent some time angrily phoning around claiming to have a signed contract, and occasionally claiming to be a senior person at Ford. Ron Dennis seemed equally livid, calling Tom Walkinshaw a traitor and claiming he'd agreed to the deal, then changed his mind. He angrily added that it looked like McLaren would be stuck with the Series 6 engine until Silverstone, when Benetton would upgrade to the Series 8 and McLaren would get their cast-offs. With an eye on the upcoming FISA meeting about the 1994 regulations in June, meanwhile, Ron Dennis offered Footwork a technical partnership, giving the FA14 their active suspension on a 2-year deal in the hope that the smaller team would then support their resistance to attempts to ban the technology. Williams had a similar deal with Ligier, who got their gearbox, but that didn't stop Cyril de Rouvre having a go at the McLaren Footwork deal. Italian electronics manufacturer Magneti Marelli, meanwhile, announced a range of off-the-shelf electronic aids at budget prices for the smaller teams. Over in the States, meanwhile, Nigel Mansell was back and in considerable pain. His injuries from the crash at Phoenix were far worse than he was letting on, but he was still able to qualify on pole ahead of the Penske pairing of Scott Tracy and Emerson Fittipaldi. At the start, F1 veterans Mario Andretti and Stefan Johansson had a prang, leaving the Swede in the wall, while the race started under a 4-lap yellow. Just as in his first rolling start at Surfers, Mansell was bushwhacked in his second, with Paul Tracy taking the lead, until a puncture at about a third distance sent him in for new boots. Another Canadian, Scott Goodyear, now passed Mansell for the lead, followed by Al Unser Jr., who fetched Mansell's Lola a bit of a clout on his way past, which put paid to his race. Little Al wasn't happy, believing Mansell had been unfairly blocking him. Robbie Gordon and Eddie Cheever had a bit of a Barney too, by which time Scott Tracy had come back and retaken the lead, followed by Andretti and Mansell, until Mario's ignition failed. Scott Goodyear hit a wall, Boesel dropped out of third with an engine failure, but Paul Tracy came through to win, with Bobby Rahal making a late charge to second and Mansell third. All of which left Mansell leading the standings by 4 points from Andretti, with the legendary Indy 500 next up. Elsewhere, there were long faces in the Williams camp as the wheels seemed to be rapidly coming off their expected dominance. Prost in particular had come under fire for his performance at Donington, finishing a lap down. He had responded by avoiding journalists as much as he could and complaining to friends about the hostile coverage, accepting blame for making a mistake at Interlagos but putting the blame firmly on the team for the 7-stop fiasco at Donington. Faces were even longer at Ferrari, though. Not only had they racked up a record equalling 37 races without a win, but the first 3 races of the season had been an unmitigated disaster. Alesi's 8th-placed finish a lap down in Brazil had been the only time an F93A had seen the checkered flag so far, with Berger's point at the opening round achieved despite his engine blowing with 3 laps to go. It was only Derek Warwick's misfortune in spinning off having not gone quite as far that had salvaged even that small mercy for the team. The arrival of Jean Todt brought optimism for the future, and this was apparently a major factor in John Alesi signing a new 2-year contract extension, but none of that would help the team this year, and it showed in the stands where ticket sales were considerably down. Eric Broadley meanwhile admitted that the Lola was just not working and recruited Sergio Rinland and ex-Benetton man Julian Cooper to design a whole new chassis, which he hoped would be ready by Germany. Meanwhile, Tyrrell had another new update to the Yamaha engine brought over direct from Japan and installed into Cesaris's car. 4 minutes after Senna's helicopter touchdown, free practice got underway. De Cesaris immediately blew the new engine, while Prost was torpedoed by his old mate Alesi and had to start qualifying proper with Hill's settings, and Senna, still a bit jet-lagged, hit the pit wall hard, as did Michael Andretti, who was having troubles with the active suspension. Hill was fastest on Friday as Prost struggled with the wrong setup, while both McLaren drivers were having serious problems with that active suspension. Afterwards, the McLaren-Benetton hostilities were renewed as Ron Dennis protested Schumacher's tyres. He had, innocently or otherwise, interpreted the Goodyear E compound tyres used by the German as experimental and therefore illegal, and the time was struck off. One barrage of Teutonic invective later, Bernie Eccleston summoned Dennis and Briatore, told them to cut it out, and then told John Korsmit to reinstate Schumacher's times. Prost was back on form on Saturday, taking his 4th pole from 4, with Hill just 0.098 seconds behind to make it 3 front rows from 4 for Williams, with Schumacher once again third, but still 1.8 seconds off the pace. Clearly there was nothing wrong with the FW15C performance-wise. Senna was fourth after crashing 3 times on Friday and having to try an Andretti's car on Saturday. Wendlinger once again doing well to go 5th in the Sauber, with Michael Andretti 6th and casting wary glances at the Sauber after their incidents in Brazil and Donington. The Ligiers were going much better here, with Blundell 7th, ahead of Berger and Deleuze, still troubled by their own active suspension, and Brundle 10th. Patrese was 11th in the second Benetton, Herbert 12th, and Barrichello improving again to 13th. Leto struggled over both days with a lack of grip and could only manage 16th, with Boutsen 19th, still too tall for the car, though Jordan were building him a new monocoque. Zanardi suffered from a repeated engine cutout, was back in 20th. De Cesaris and Katayama both had a series of technical problems, and it was left to the Minardis and Lolas, both just lacking in speed, to duke it out to avoid relegation. On this occasion it was Ferrari veteran Michele Alboreto who'd miss out, 4/10 off his teammate and 2/10 off the back of the grid, and 5.7 seconds off pole. Sunday came, and with an almighty groan the F1 circus awoke to heavy rain showers, and stewards extended the morning warm-up by 15 minutes to give the teams a chance to dial in their wet settings. By race time, the rain had stopped, but the track was still very wet and everyone would start on grooved tyres. Senna was beaming, while Prost looked even more like he was chewing a wasp than usual. Alesi tried to gee up the fans by carrying a Ferrari flag round to the grid, which went down very well, and then they were ready to go. Prost felt his car creeping forward as the red lights came on and dabbed the brakes just as the lights went green. Fortunately, he was still able to get away well enough, but Hill got alongside as they went into Tamburello, where Blundell lost control of his Ligier and went crashing into the inner wall, losing a wheel, as Hill jinked left and right to keep a charging Senna behind him. Barrichello had been slow away and tangled with Fittipaldi in the wake of Blundell's accident, both coming in for new tyres at the end of opening lap, while Patrese spun and stalled at the exit to Tosa. Clearly those were treacherous conditions. Hill nearly went off himself, bouncing across the grass at Acqua Minerale, but without losing a place, and he crossed the line in the lead with Senna and Prost hot on his heels, and a little further back, Schumacher, Berger, Wendlinger and Andretti, with a lazy Brundle and Herbert rounding out the top 10. Hill was already pulling away from Senna as a dry line began to appear on the track, but it was still very slippery, especially at Acqua Minerale and on the run down to Rivazza, so it wasn't time to switch to slicks just yet. Boutsen pulled in on lap 2 with a faulty hydraulic pump, but it proved unfixable and he was out. With Hill way out in front now, Senna and Prost were having another one of their duels, with Senna managing to keep a cagey Prost behind him, the Frenchman unwilling to get too far off the drying line. By the end of lap 5, Hill was over 8 seconds ahead, with Schumacher, Berger, Wendlinger and Andretti in a cluster about 12 seconds behind the Senna-Prost scrap. James Allen had a quick word with an unhurt Mark Blundell in the pits, just as Prost finally got round Senna when the Brazilian made a slight mistake on the exit from Tosa. He came in the next lap for slicks, the first of the top drivers to do so, while his teammate Andretti was having a terrific scrap with Wendlinger, who peeled in at the end of the lap himself. Prost was in next time around, followed by Schumacher and Berger, but the Austrian's gearbox broke as he got away, the team quickly wheeling the car into the garage with a lazy expected any second. And Michael Andretti also made his first F1 pit stop, having not previously lasted long enough to need one. So, Hill now led Senna by 24 seconds, with Prost just behind, and as the pits turned into a hive of activity, the other Williams came in on lap 11. He got out just ahead of Senna and Prost, having maybe stayed out just a little bit too long on wets. No sooner was he out than there was traffic in front in the shape of Badoer and De Cesaris. The Italian director cut away to watch Alesi's pit stop, and when he returned to the action, the Williamses had swapped places. Prost had pounced at Tosa, then pulled past Hill at Piratella too, while Senna had also bushwhacked Hill at the same time. So now it was Prost leading from Senna and Hill, with Schumacher 4th, 23 seconds behind Damon, then Wendlinger, Andretti and Deleuze still running close together, with Brundle, Leto and Herbert in 8th, 9th and 10th. The leaders came past Suzuki and Comas having their own battle, and Aguri nearly took Senna out in his eagerness to pass the LaRousse, which wouldn't have done much for the new technology sharing deal, but there was an even hairier incident a few laps later, with Prost pulling out a gap and Hill now threatening Senna. They were held up by a scrapping Barrichello and Zanardi until Rubens spun on the exit from Tosa and pirouetted right across the bows of Hill's Williams, which somehow managed not to hit it. But he had to brake, and that gave Senna a chance to pull away. In fact, Hill was finding his brake pedal rather spongy, and next time round at Tosa, he put it on the floor and nothing happened, so he coasted into the gravel to retire. So Schumacher was promoted to 3rd, with Wendlinger 4th, Andretti gaining on him, and Alesi up into the points. Prost was by now lapping a second and a half faster than Senna, who seemed to have settled for the situation for the time being, and was husbanding his car. As half-distance approached, Andretti had now caught back up to Wendlinger again, as the Austrian had difficulty lapping Aguri Suzuki, while his teammate Warwick had his own brake problem and went into the wall at Variante Bassa. Coming through Tosa, Andretti squeezed up the inside under braking, but Wendlinger crossed behind and took the place back despite a colossal wobble as they accelerated away. At Variante Alta, Michael's brakes failed, he nearly went into the back of the Sauber and his rear end snapped round, sliding him across the grass and the track into another spin, and this time he couldn't quite keep the engine running. Another retirement for Andretti Jr., but he'd given much better account of himself this time. Alesi was thus promoted to the dizzy heights of 5th, and had caught Wendlinger as he still couldn't get past Suzuki. As they came round Tosa again, Jean moved out in his turn, but this time he had the legs on Wendlinger and took the place, and was in turn blocked by Suzuki, making a frustrated gesture to the marshal stands as he came down the pit straight. He got by shortly afterwards and set about the 41-second gap to Michael Schumacher, and the podium place that would do so much to give heart to Ferrari team and fans alike. Lap 40, 2/3 distance, and Prost set the fastest lap once more as Wendlinger's engine was beginning to fade, and Brundle also came past. And then Alesi was pulling off on the hill up from Tosa, his clutch having put paid to his and the Tifosi's hopes. As he wearily climbed out and waved to the fans, and James Allen talked to Michael Andretti, the cameras cut away to another stationary McLaren. Senna had had a leak in the hydraulics for his active suspension, and that was that, his first DNF of the year, and a gift for Prost as he could now make up 10 points in the championship. By now only Allan and Schumacher were on the lead lap, with Brundle promoted to 3rd and looking for his first finish of the year, Wendlinger 4th, Leto 5th, and the low tide chasing the two Saubers. It was drizzling again, and there were spots of water on the lenses of the in-car cameras, but it wasn't as yet enough to need a change of tyres. As Brundle forced his way past Suzuki, battle was joined between the two Sauber teammates, while Barbazza bounced across the curbs at Acqua Minerale and spun, but was able to get going again. Wendlinger had started the race on a full wet setup, was finding his engine still spluttering, and was still stuck behind Suzuki. By now Leto and Herbert were queued up behind the Austrian, and on lap 48 he waved them both through, and peeled in at the end of the lap to have his engine looked at. Nothing could be done, but he put on a set of wets and shot out of the pits on full chat to see what he could do. Leto and Herbert, now duking it out over 4th, were behind Barbazza and Suzuki, as Zanardi arrived on the tail of the Suzuki train, having a quick go at Herbert which nearly ended in tears on lap 50. Suzuki was eventually called in for a 10-second stop-go penalty for blocking, as Wendlinger trundled back in for another poke at his misfiring engine, only to leave again, then park up on his outlap. Prost was now nearly 50 seconds ahead and cruising comfortably to a win, while Zanardi had got ahead of Herbert while the TV coverage was watching Suzuki and Wendlinger in the pits, and young Andrea was now right on Leto's tail. On lap 53, Leto got it a bit sideways at Acqua Minerale and nearly took off the Lotus's nose as he recovered, while Sandro nearly collected Johnny in the rear under braking. Somehow they all survived that one in the same places. Zanardi, driving in front of Italian fans for the first time in an F1 car and having come up from 20th on the grid, was all over Leto as Schumacher approached to lap the three of them. At the end of the next lap, Zanardi attacked again, only for the Finn to brake a little early for Variante Bassa, sending the Lotus off the track, bouncing along the crash barriers and back onto the main straight, breaking an oil line in the process, and he set off again, the back of his car merrily ablaze. He seemed entirely unaware of this, only pulling off as his left rear wheel decided to abandon ship round Tamburello, and Zanardi finally admitted defeat and pulled over in front of the fire marshal's station. So, back to Herbert to take up the attack on Leto, whose engine was also now starting to misfire a bit, while Schumacher seemed to have decided to hang back and let the pair of them fight rather than trying to insert himself. But it was all too much for Herbert's Ford V8, which let out all the magic blue smoke with just 2 laps to go, a real blow for Lotus, who'd been looking to consolidate their 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship with a double points finish just a few laps earlier. So Philippe Alliot came up into 5th place, and Barbazza into 6th, as Suzuki bounced across Acqua Minerale, now suffering braking problems of his own. Prost began his last lap with a 30-second lead over Schumacher, having eased off a bit. JJ Leto's Sauber-badged Ilmor engine followed the example of Herbert's Ford, but luckily for the Finn, he was a whole lap ahead of Alliot and Barbazza, so would still keep his 4th place regardless. And so the survivors trailed in, Prost taking his 46th win in dominant style, and one much needed to steady the ship. Schumacher had driven a fairly uneventful race to come in a good 2nd, with his old teammate Martin Brundle a very welcome 3rd to open his account with Ligier. It was the first finish of 1993 for both of them. Leto, Alio and Barbazza were classified 4th, 5th and 6th, with the only other runners at the end Badoer 7th and 3 laps down, and Suzuki 9th and 7 laps down after spending several minutes in the pits having his brakes looked at. Leto hitched a lift back on Alio's Larousse, while Barbazza was wearing an even toothier grin than usual after his second successive points finish, having started dead last on the grid. So, Prost cut Senna's championship lead to 2 points, and to double Hill's points tally in third, while Lotus watched both Benetton and Ligier overhaul them in the constructors' table, as Williams now had a 10-point lead at the top. Ferrari, meanwhile, was still firmly stuck on 1 point, 1/5 of the points of the lowly Minardi team. Prost understandably looked much happier after the race, but was still not keen to talk to reporters, and indeed said he'd no longer be talking about what had gone on technically with his car since it was only ever used as a stick to beat him with. Damon Hill was summoned to the McLaren garage so Senna could tear a strip off him for jinking at the start, apparently the first time the two had actually met. "You're new to this sport, you should be careful, it's a dangerous sport, you don't zigzag in front of me," said Senna. "Well, thanks Ayrton, but I don't think I did anything that I haven't seen you do before," replied Hill. Barbazza, Leto, Brundle and Alio, scoring his first points since 1989, and their respective teams were all delighted, Williams and Benetton were satisfied, and McLaren just looking forward to putting the weekend behind them at the next race in Barcelona.